and welcome to the Building Context. We're going to have a look primarily at Year 8 and the scheme of learning that's currently being taught, so approach over time. But we're equally thinking about how this skill progresses from Year 7 all the way through to Key Stage 5. In the beginning, Year 7 will look at this particular format when they're considering context. So it will mirror a skill that you might recognise from paper 2, question 1 for a GCSE. But actually what they're doing here is they're reading information for meaning, they're decoding, they're synthesising, they're summarising, and they're basically looking for 4 correct statements and they're using their knowledge of the text. But as a very important byproduct of doing so, they're actually gauging an understanding of the writer's context. Now, at this stage, the context is focused primarily on the autobiography of the poet. So here we've got some information about Wordsworth's life, where he lived, his parents, but it will equally begin to talk about the sort of genre that he writes within. So again, that kind of context of the writing, but equally some of the key themes that he will discuss. So the importance of nature and the poet and how he's influenced by it. And when we think about context, if you look at the phrase content, it's a really important skill. So if you imagine this early introduction to Wordsworth and that understanding of his life is providing the foundation really for any further discussion about this poet, whether that's in Year 8 or later in Year 9 or even within Year 10 and Year 11, students have given this foundation beforehand, because it's highly unlikely that you would spend a lesson, maybe in Year 11, where you would look at the autobiographical context of the writer. In fact, you're kind of more encouraged to think about the social context or the way that the text responds to a particular idea about society. So what is the writer teaching us? But that can only really be achieved if the students understand where this poet comes from and the key factors that would be influencing their writing. So this is an important part of context. They do need a grounding in understanding the poet, their life and how their writing responds to that, so that when they come to GCSE, they don't have to go over their autobiographical context. They can focus primarily on what is the writer teaching us about society in this text. I've selected the next couple of slides in the Year 8 scheme because I think it demonstrates quite quickly how students have to move from understanding the life of the writer to understanding that the writer has consciously crafted a piece of writing to discuss a concept or a big idea, and context connects to that. So not to bore you, but when you think about the GCSE mark scheme, when we discuss AO3 for literature, it's always on the back of AO1, task and text. It's that understanding that the context informs the task and the text and the way that we appreciate this piece of writing. In short, they're all interconnected. And this is like the first stab at this in Year 8. So you can see very quickly they've been given the propaganda posters that talk about the way that Great Britain had encouraged soldiers to enlist, and we're given the key concepts that link to it. So they're being asked in this particular bell task prior to the end of the lesson to consider what this suggests about the way that society viewed war at the beginning of the war. And you can see that tied to that we have the key concepts from the lesson. So we've got the glorification of war, the unrealistic portrayal of war versus the accurate reflection of war, how propaganda was used to indoctrinate soldiers into enlisting, and the brutality and horrors of war. And you can see all the words that are in bold are part of our conceptual vocabulary that students would be using when they're approaching the text. But what's particularly interesting is that they begin to start to see how context and the writer's ideas are merging together. It's almost as though context, such as the autobiographical context of the writer, isn't on its own, on a silo, detached away from the text. It's their first real experience, I think, when they begin to consider how the two are interconnected, and to understand the message of the poem, they need to understand the social context that surrounds it. So we have moved from how context connects to concepts. Now we're thinking about how context can frame perspectives. And again, this is taken from the Year 8 scheme, and in this particular scheme they are focusing upon the perspective of Tennyson and the idea of patriotism. Now, that discussion on patriotism can only take place from that prior work on propaganda in World War One. So you can see how context is kind of threaded through. So they're able to look at how a writer's perspective, although quite distant from Owen's, can be shaped by their social context. So Owen seems to reject that in their accurate portrayal of the realities of war, whereas Tennyson seems to kind of put forward a more patriotic view and the idea that war is a just cause. So you can see that they have the quotation given to them in the yellow box, and then they've been given some adjectives to describe the writer's perspective. So you can see here that it could be that they describe Tennyson's perspective as being quite opinionated maybe, or maybe he's been quite analytical. Just because it's in the Year 8 section, it could be that they think about some of the words that are in the Year 7 column, or equally some of the words in the Year 9 column. It might just be that if for the Year 9 column you would need to find those a bit further. You'll also notice at the bottom you've got the conceptual vocabulary for the lesson just referring to, and it could be that you get students to think about how Tennyson, for instance, views patriotism as loyalty to your country, and that's what he's presenting in this particular quotation. So again, you've got this real nice merging of context and how that context could differ to perhaps Owen, and that's something I've studied previously in the scheme. You've got that link to a piece of text, so this is the part of the text where we feel this perspective is being shown, and a really firm understanding that the writer has a strong viewpoint. What are they valuing? What are they criticising about war in this particular instance? So on to Key Stage 4, and this activity is taken from Paper 2 Question 4. So this will happen perhaps at the beginning of the lesson when students are kind of returning to those sources they've worked upon for question 2 and question 3. But we're going to ask them to go back and have a look at the context boxes at the top of the sources. And in doing so, if you look at the yellow box, we focus upon any contextual clues that we can pull out from those boxes. So if we take source A, for instance, we're told that the title of the non-fiction book is called The Other Side of the Dale, which sounds kind of creepy and quite scary actually. But when we think about that, you could start to make predictions about the place or the location, the setting. So it could be that this place has been largely detached from the rest of society, or maybe neglected or abandoned. And then when we drop further down, we can see that the person that's writing the text was once a school inspector. So I'd be encouraging the students to think about the behaviour of a school inspector, what they're there to do, for instance. And then we're told that they're there to inspect a primary school in Crompton. Now, that gives our students a frame of reference. Before they start reading the extract, they understand where the location is, they understand something about the writer and potentially their intention at this point. And I think when they're reading, they can either prove the earlier predictions they've made about the text or largely ignore them. It doesn't really matter, they're just engaging with that context and it's giving them a frame of reference. But I think the most important part of this activity is when they've looked at the contextual clues from both context boxes, is to encourage them then to think, well, will they have a similar viewpoint? So even though we're talking about schools or largely education system, based upon this early sort of work that we've done on the context box, would they have a similar viewpoint? And 9 times out of 10, it's no. So you can see here in source B, it's about the ragged schools, and you can even talk about here about the poor behaviour of the children. We're talking about the idea that the teachers being almost kind of sent there. The children that go there are largely poor. It could be that the ragged school itself is given unsuitable buildings, and maybe the teacher hasn't got the resources to be able to educate as effectively as they want to. So you can begin to see here that we've got 2 different perspectives emerging, and just that work of looking at the context, thinking about how the context would inform the writing, and then think, well, that might have shaped the writer's viewpoint on that particular topic. That's a really quick way in. Students have already got a perspective to sort of kind of hang their argument onto and to really search for when they're approaching the text. And last but by no means least, Key Stage 5. So Key Stage 5 looks at context in a slightly different way to sort of Key Stage 4. The emphasis here is on representation. So in that particular piece of editorial writing, how has the topic or how has the text producer or text receiver been represented in that. And to talk about representation, they have to refer back to their context 9, and that could be how the text responds to gender, politics, advertising, the Industrial Revolution. That'll have a massive impact on 19th century texts that they have to engage with, the generational gap, media bias, sexuality, equality, and things like, more recently, pandemics and medicine, for instance, COVID-19. So when students are looking at that, they're thinking about, well, what are the driving contextual factors within that text? So it could be that you're given, I think there's one example of Sam's material. It could be that the students are given a text that argues for the banishment of goths in Whitby during Halloween time. And when they really think about the sort of underlying context behind that, they could see two opposing viewpoints. So the representation of the goth as a menace to society, but equally the idea that the tourist board have wanted this event to be established within that community as well, and there being a tension between the people that see themselves as native to Whitby and the people that are trying to encourage economic growth. And I think when you begin to unpick that context and the way that the media has represented that particular idea and the ongoing tension between the council and the people that live within Whitby, students are able to uncover how the idea has been represented, but more importantly than that, about the difficulties and conflicts in their representation of a particular topic. So that's the end of the session on handling context. Again, if you have any questions, please raise them with your link director and they'll be happy to go through that with you.